On the evening of August 12, 1985, families across Japan were preparing to celebrate Obon, a cherished Buddhist holiday, for visiting relatives and honoring ancestors. Tokyo's Haneda Airport bustled with travelers heading home, and among the dozens of flights departing that evening was Japan Airlines Flight 123, bound for Osaka. It was a routine domestic flight that would take just 54 minutes. However, nobody could have imagined that this flight would become the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history. But before we get into this video, I would really appreciate it if you guys could give it a like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And with that said, let's get straight into the video. The aircraft operating this flight was a Boeing 747 SR-46. The SR designation stood for short range, a variant specifically designed for Japan Airlines to handle unique demands of Japan's domestic market. Unlike the standard 747s built for long international flights, this aircraft has been reinforced with a stronger fuselage and a more robust landing gear to withstand the constant stress of frequent takeoffs, landings, and pressurization cycles on the short routes between Japanese cities. At the time of the accident, the airplane had accumulated a total flight time of 25,000 hours and 18,000 landings. For Boeing 747, this represented intensive use over its 7-year service life. In the cockpit that evening sat 3 experienced aviators. Captain Masami Takahama, age 49, served as a training instructor, having logged about 12,000 flight hours, including about 4,800 flight hours on the type. First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, age 39, was undergoing training for promotion to captain and flew Flight 123 as one of his final training flights, acting as a captain while sitting in the left seat. Flight engineer Hiroshi Fukada, age 46, was a veteran with about 9,000 flight hours, including 3,800 hours on the type. The aircraft's cabin was configured in a high-density layout to maximize capacity on this popular domestic route. On this particular evening, the flight was carrying 524 people, 509 passengers, and 15 crew members. The plane was nearly at capacity, with families, business people, and off-duty airline employees all traveling during the holiday rush. Among the passengers was 26-year-old Yumi Oichi, an off-duty Japan Airlines flight attendant returning home to Osaka to visit her family. She had recently married and loved her career with the airline. On this flight, she was simply a passenger, seated in row 56 near the rear of the aircraft. At 6:12 p.m., Flight 123 took off from Haneda Airport bound for Osaka's Itami Airport. The departure was unremarkable. The 747 climbed smoothly into the evening sky, beginning its ascent towards cruising altitude. The passengers settled into their seats, some reading magazines, others gazing out at Tokyo's sprawling cityscape shrinking below. Approximately 12 minutes after takeoff at an altitude of 24,000 feet, at an airspeed around 300 knots, a bang and vibration and cabin decompression was recorded on the cockpit voice recorder. Yumi Oichi later recalled, "I was reading a magazine in 56C seat. The atmosphere around the rear part of the plane was unchanged from usual. At 6:25, there was a loud crash from overhead and my ears hurt." She described how the interior of the cabin suddenly became all white and oxygen masks immediately dropped from the ceiling. What passengers and crew couldn't see was a catastrophic structural failure occurring at the rear of the aircraft. The aft pressure bulkhead had ruptured, and the pressurized air in the cabin blew out into the aft fuselage, blowing off the auxiliary power unit or APU and portions of the tail cone, forcing considerable part of the vertical stabilizer to break off. At the same time, all 4 hydraulic systems were severed, making the flight control surfaces inoperable. The vertical stabilizer, the large vertical tail fin that provides directional stability, had been blown away. Without it and without hydraulic control, the aircraft was essentially uncontrollable. At 46 seconds after decompression, The captain signaled an emergency on the transponder and requested a return to Tokyo. 32 minutes of struggle. What followed was an extraordinary display of skill, determination, and courage under impossible circumstances. The crew found themselves piloting a crippled aircraft with virtually no directional control. The 747 began to oscillate wildly in what pilots call a phugoid cycle, a rhythmic pattern of climbing and descending, combined with a severe Dutch roll, where the aircraft swayed side to side like a ship in the storm. The combined phugoid and Dutch roll caused the plane to fly like a ship on a storm-tossed sea, rising and falling, rolling and plunging, swaying back and forth as it staggered forward, unstable on every axis of motion. In the cabin, terror gripped the passengers. The violent motions threw people against the restraints. Loose items flew through the air. Some passengers, realizing the gravity of the situation, began writing farewell messages to their loved ones. In the cockpit, Captain Takahama and his crew worked desperately to control the aircraft using only the engines, varying thrust on the left and right side to steer the massive jet. It was an incredibly difficult technique that few pilots had ever attempted outside of simulators. Tokyo Control contacted the aircraft and asked the nature of the emergency. At this point, hypoxia appeared to have begun setting in, as the pilots did not respond immediately. The captain and co-pilot asked the flight engineer repeatedly if hydraulic pressure had been lost, seemingly unable to comprehend it. Only then did the captain report that the aircraft had become uncontrollable. Uncontrolled, Captain Takahama reported to air traffic control, a chilling two-syllable word that conveyed the dire situation. For 32 agonizing minutes, the crew fought to save their aircraft and everyone on board. They tried everything, adjusting the engine power, attempting to maintain altitude, desperately seeking a place to attempt an emergency landing. The aircraft continued to fly with severe Dutch roll and phugoid motions for about 32 minutes. Years later, aviation experts would attempt to recreate the scenario in flight simulators. None could keep the aircraft aloft for even half of the time that Captain Takahama and his crew managed. Their skill and determination were nothing short of remarkable. But unfortunately, physics and engineering have the limits. The crash. Finally, at about 6:56 p.m., the aircraft crashed into the south ridge of Mount Takamagara, also known as Mount Osutaka. Towering over 1,500 meters high near Ueno village, the impact was devastating. The flight hit Mount Osutaka at a speed of 340 knots, or more than 391 miles per hour. The Boeing 747 disintegrated on impact, scattering wreckage across the mountainside. The crash site was in an extremely remote and treacherous location, accessible only by helicopter or by foot through difficult mountain terrain. The crash was attributed to a missing tail fin that was likely structurally weakened because of frequent landings and takeoffs. Not until 14 hours after the crash were emergency crews able to reach the area. A Japan Self-Defense Forces helicopter spotted the crash after nightfall, but couldn't land due to poor visibility and mountain terrain. The pilots reported seeing no signs of survivor in the air. The decision was made to wait until morning to launch a full ground rescue operation. This delay, however, would prove tragic. Medical staff had found 4 survivors out of 524 passengers in the debris. They also had identified bodies with such injuries that suggested many had died from shock and overnight exposure. One doctor said that if the discovery had come 10 hours earlier, we could have found more survivors. The 4 survivors were all female passengers seated in the last 7 rows of the aircraft, the only section that remained relatively intact. They were Yumi Oichi, a 26-year-old off-duty flight attendant, 12-year-old Keiko Kawakami, and mother and daughter Hiroko and Mikikoko Yoshizaki. Yumi Oichi was trapped in row 56 and lived for another 16 hours overnight until rescue. She woke when the rescuers shouted, "You are all right now," and pulled her from the wreckage. She had a fractured pelvis and arm. Oichi said she recalled bright lights and helicopter sounds shortly after waking up amidst the wreckage. She could hear screaming and moaning from other survivors, but the sounds gradually died away throughout the night. This heartbreaking testimony confirmed what investigators suspected, that an estimated 20 to 50 passengers had actually survived the initial crash, but died from their injuries while awaiting rescue. Keiko Kawakami, 12 years old and the only survivor from her family of 4, was found hanging from the branches of a nearby tree. She had been catapulted out of her seat when the airliner hit the mountain and landed on top of a nearby bush. While she suffered extensive injuries and had to be treated at a hospital for 3 months, she fully recovered, though she lost both her parents and her younger sister in the crash. The toll was unimaginable. The crash had killed all 15 crew members and 505 of the 509 passengers on board. The investigation. Japan's Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission, assisted by the US's NTSB and Boeing, launched an extensive investigation. What they discovered was, quite frankly, shocking. This disaster had been 7 years in the making. On June 2, 1978, the airplane experienced a severe tail strike incident during landing at Osaka, Japan. Several aft fuselage frames, skins, and the aft pressure bulkhead were substantially damaged. At the time, the airplane had 6,200 hours and 12,000 cycles, and required significant repairs. Boeing dispatched an airplane on-ground team to perform the repairs. The job was complex. They needed to replace the damaged lower half of the aft pressure bulkhead. The correct repair procedure called for a single continuous splice plate with 3 rows of rivets to join the new section to the existing structure. But the Boeing team had made a critical error. The subsequent repair of the bulkhead did not conform to Boeing's approved repair methods. Boeing's repair procedure calls for 1 continuous splice plate. Instead, the Boeing team used 2 splice plates, one above the other, with only 2 rows of rivets connecting each plate to the bulkhead. This modification had devastating consequences. A review after the Flight 123 crash determined that this decreased the strength of the area by about 70%. With only 70% of the required strength, the repair was, quite frankly, a time bomb. The single middle rivet row became the origin of structural fatigue cracking. These cracks connected rivet to rivet and propagated through the crack stop straps. The modified splice error could not be found through visual inspections since the gap was filled with fillet sealant. During the investigation, the Accident Investigation Commission calculated that this incorrect installation would fail after about 11,000 pressurization cycles. The aircraft had accomplished 12,318 successful flights from that time, from the time that the faulty repair was made to when the crash happened. So every flight, every pressurization cycle added stress to those fatigue cracks. They grew slowly and invisibly, hidden beneath the sealant. And on August 12, 1985, during Flight 123's climb to cruising altitude, the weakened bulkhead finally gave way. The aftermath. The disaster devastated Japan. The crash is the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history and remains the deadliest aviation incident in Japan. The president of Japan Airlines at the time, Yasumoto Takagi, assumed responsibility for the accident and resigned. The company's maintenance manager, Hiro Tominaga, tragically committed suicide. Boeing also acknowledged its responsibility in the faulty repair. The investigation led to significant changes in aviation safety. On May 26, 1987, the FAA issued AD 87-12-04 to require installation of a hydraulic fuse in the number of 4 hydraulic systems on Boeing Model 747 series airplanes. Additionally, it required inspection for damage and cracking of the aft pressure bulkhead on other Boeing Model 747 airplanes. These directives were later strengthened with additional repetitive inspection requirements. The accident also influenced future aviation incidents in unexpected ways. In 1989, United Airlines Flight 232 experienced a complete loss of hydraulic control after an engine failure. The Czech pilot aboard that flight, Dennis Fitch, had studied the JAL 123 case and practiced similar scenarios in simulators. His knowledge contributed to the crew's ability to perform a controlled crash landing that saved 184 out of the 296 people aboard. In 2006, the Safety Promotion Center opened on the grounds of Haneda Airport. This center was created for training purposes to alert employees to the importance of airline safety and the responsibility to ensure safety. The center has displays regarding aviation safety, the history of the crash, and selected pieces of the aircraft and passenger effects, including handwritten farewell notes. Families of the victims, together with local volunteer groups, hold an annual memorial gathering every August 12th near the crash site in Gunma Prefecture. The mountain path to the crash site has been improved to allow visitors to pay their respects. The 3 cockpit crew members, Captain Takahama, First Officer Sasaki, and Flight Engineer Fukada, were awarded the Polaris Award in 1987 for their extraordinary efforts to save the aircraft and their passengers. Aviation experts worldwide recognize their 32-minute struggle to control an essentially uncontrollable aircraft as one of the most remarkable displays of airmanship in aviation history. Today, Japan Airlines Flight 123 stands as a somber reminder of how a single maintenance error can have catastrophic consequences years later. It underscores the critical importance of following proper repair procedures, conducting thorough inspections, and maintaining the highest standards of aviation safety. The 520 people who perished on that August evening were not statistics. They were fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, colleagues and friends. They were people returning home for the holidays, traveling for business, visiting loved ones. Their loss forever changed hundreds of families and an entire nation. The 4 survivors carried forward the burden of survival, each bearing physical and psychological scars that would last a lifetime. The captain's daughter, Yoko Takahama, who was a high school student at the time of the crash, went on to become a JAL flight attendant, honoring her father's memory by dedicating her career to the same airline and the same passengers he had tried so valiantly to save. Every year on August 12th, as the sun sets over Mount Takamagahara, those who remember make the pilgrimage to the crash site. They climb the mountain paths, they light incense, they leave flowers, and they remember the 520 lives cut short, and 3 pilots who fought until the very end to bring them home safely. Japan Airlines Flight 123 reminds us that aviation safety is built not just on technology and regulations, but on human vigilance, proper procedures, and the understanding that even the smallest error can have unimaginable consequences. It is a legacy written in sorrow, but one that has made aviation safer for millions of passengers in the decade since. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you would like to see more videos, YouTube thinks you should watch the video on screen right now. If you'd like to see more plane crash videos, you can check out my playlist here. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, be sure to leave them in the comments section down below. And if you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe. And with all that said, I will see you all in the next video.